Hello everybody, welcome back. So this is the second video for chapter 12. In the previous video, I talked about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and macroeconomic equilibrium. So watch that video first. And now I'm going to talk about changes in the equilibrium. So it's again very similar to chapter 3. If you remember in chapter 3, when we defined market equilibrium, then we started shifting our demand and supply at the equilibrium. We first started with the cases where we shift our demand, we kept the supply fixed, then we changed the supply and kept the demand fixed, and then we had our complex cases. We do not have complex cases in chapter 12, so that's a good thing. So we're just going to talk about shifting our aggregate demand when aggregate supply is fixed in this chapter. Then we're going to shift our aggregate supply and we're going to keep the aggregate demand fixed. That's it. No complex cases in chapter 12, but we did have complex cases in chapter 3. So let's just start with the change in aggregate demand at the equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium. So if anything changes in the market that impacts the aggregate demand, there will be a shift. Anything other than price. Again, remember, as I mentioned it in the previous video. So let's say that people start spending more. That's the reason that we have, let's say, increase in our aggregate demand at the equilibrium. Okay, so now we have a rightward shift in our aggregate demand. If you look at the notes and look at the graph, you can see that our upward slope aggregate supply is fixed. We have higher aggregate demand, so we have a rightward shift in our aggregate demand. So we're no longer obviously at our original equilibrium. We have a new equilibrium. But here is the important thing. If you remember in chapter 9, when the economy is at full employment, we call the level of real GDP potential GDP, right? So when we are at macroeconomic equilibrium, we are pretty much at full employment. We still have fractional unemployment, structural unemployment, we still have seasonal unemployment, but we do not have cyclical unemployment. So when we say we are at macroeconomic equilibrium, we are basically at full employment. We have that 5% natural unemployment rate. But if you remember in chapter 9, we call the level of GDP when we are at full employment potential GDP. So when we are at macroeconomic equilibrium, our real GDP, our equilibrium real GDP is our potential GDP. But now that we have increase in aggregate demand, the real GDP is not the potential GDP. There is a gap. Again, if you go back to chapter 9, we called the gap between potential GDP and actual real GDP output gap, and we could calculate that output gap in chapter 9. So if you look at the graph that we have here for changes in equilibrium in the lecture notes, because we have this gap between real GDP and our potential GDP, there is a name for this gap. We call this gap inflationary gap, because right now our real GDP is greater than our potential GDP. Okay, so we call this gap inflationary gap. So inflationary gap happens when real GDP is greater than potential GDP, and don't forget, it is caused by increase in aggregate demand. If you look at the graph, it's very similar to chapter 3. We have obviously more output, and at the same time we have higher prices. Since we're talking about the entire economy, it means that we have inflation. So everything became more expensive. So the price level actually is going up. We have more output in the economy, but at a higher cost. We call this gap inflationary gap because the higher aggregate demand is causing inflation, okay? So we have a gap right now between our real GDP and our potential GDP, okay? If aggregate demand decreases and we have a leftward shift in our aggregate demand, when aggregate supply is fixed, again we have a gap between potential GDP, our original equilibrium basically, okay, and our new real GDP, which is the actual real GDP that you see in the economy. We call this gap recessionary gap because if you look at the graph, this time the prices are lower, right? The price is going down for everything in the economy, but at the same time, the quantity is decreasing. So the level of output for everything in the economy is going down. So we have recession, and we call the gap between our actual GDP, which is lower than before, and our potential GDP, which is coming from the macroeconomic equilibrium or our original equilibrium, recessionary gap, because the level of output is pretty low. So you can think about what's happening right now because of COVID-19. The aggregate demand is going down in the economy. People are scared of spending money. So the consumption expenditure, which is a big component in aggregate demand, is going down. People are not investing enough right now in the economy. So I component is also going down. So you can imagine what's happening to aggregate demand. So there is a huge drop in our aggregate demand. Of course, the government is trying to kind of offset the declining consumption expenditures and investment by spending more and increasing the government spending by all those paychecks that are coming to our households if we are eligible, of course, to receive it. The Federal Reserve is doing things to kind of boost the economy, but of course it will take a while for us to see the impact on aggregate demand. But right now the aggregate demand is going down, so we're all kind of dealing with this recessionary gap, right? The level of output is going down. You cannot find some of the items that you typically buy for your households, like toilet paper, right? I don't know, those wipes. There is no hand sanitizer. Some of even the things that you typically buy to eat, like chicken, eggs, you cannot find them every time you go to the grocery stores, right? So that's the recessionary gap that you see because of the recession, because of the reduction in aggregate demand. People are just freaked out. They're not going to spend money. Some people are losing their jobs. So there is a significant drop in our aggregate demand. So we kind of have a name for the gap between potential GDP and our actual real GDP when aggregate demand changes, okay? If aggregate demand is increasing, we call the gap between potential GDP and real GDP inflationary gap because the increase in aggregate demand will cause inflation. And we call the gap between potential GDP and real GDP when aggregate demand is falling recessionary gap because when aggregate demand decreases, the level of output will drop. That's why we call it recessionary gap. We really don't have a specific name for the gap that is caused by changes in aggregate supply. Okay, we just don't. We only use recessionary gap and inflationary gap for the changes in aggregate demand. Now let's talk about shift in aggregate supply. As I mentioned in the previous video, the main thing that changes and shifts aggregate supply is the price of resources, price of input, especially oil. So the example that I put actually for the lecture note is the change in price of oil. So let's just start with the time that there is a fall in the price of oil. So if oil becomes less expensive, it means that the cost of production for everybody is going down, for all the producers, just like chapter 3. So aggregate supply should increase. The cost is going down, so the producers are able to supply more. Again, we're talking about the time that everything is normal. We're experiencing something different, completely different right now because of COVID-19. So however, the price of resources are lower, the oil prices are low, but you do not see an increase in aggregate supply as I mentioned, okay? But in typical times, the aggregate supply should increase. aggregate demand is fixed, is not shifting, but our aggregate supply is shifting rightward, okay? Because the aggregate supply is increasing. So if aggregate supply increases, then the price is dropping, right? Just like chapter 3, and we have more output, right? So this is the time that we kind of experience expansion in the economy. Everything is cheaper than before, and we have more output for everybody in the economy. This is what we like to see, right? Expansion. Economy is booming, growing. We have enough output for everybody. The inverse happens when the price of resources increase. When the cost of production is going up, it's expensive for the producers to produce more output, right? So the price of oil, let's say, is increasing. So aggregate supply will go down. We have a left-ward shift in aggregate supply. As a result, the aggregate demand is fixed. As a result, price of everything in the economy will increase. Everything becomes more expensive. We have lower amount of output. So our real GDP is dropping and everything becomes more expensive. We are experiencing inflation because everything is more expensive, and recession because we have less amount of output. We call this situation stagflation. So stagflation happens when we experience both inflation and recession at the same time. It might happen because of COVID-19, but the reason is not because the price of input, especially oil, is higher. It happens because the price of many input is going up because many of our resources are coming from China or other countries. Okay, so we might experience a stagflation. However, typically in United States, the Federal Reserve controls the inflation. We have like a target for inflation rate, which is around 2%. So even in 2008, we didn't really experience inflation. However, when I was doing a regular grocery, I realized that some stuff are more expensive than before. For the same amount of things that we typically buy for our home, like milk, eggs, chicken, I don't know, bread, things like that, I paid actually more. So I kind of realized that the prices are changing, but the change in the price is due to a high demand right now. People are just panicking. That's why they're buying more and more and more. So that's why we see this increase in price. So it's not necessarily because of the aggregate supply here, but as I said, we are experiencing a very kind of different situation that we really didn't see before. So we are kind of experiencing recession. We're kind of experiencing inflation, but they are not. Really. They cannot be explained in a way that we typically explain, like the reduction in aggregate supply or the increase in aggregate demand, because many things are happening at the same time. So I'm just trying to kind of relate it to what we see right now, which is very, very unique. And sometimes we cannot even explain it with all these economic theories that we study. Okay, that's pretty much it for this chapter. Definitely look at the other videos that I posted on D2L. Definitely read the textbook, lecture notes, look at the exercises that I posted, and let me know if you have any question. Definitely review chapter 3 if you don't remember shifting, demand, supply. Okay, so I'll see you later in future chapters. Let me know if you have any question. Bye.